Welcome to Sparking Equity. I'm Pedro Noguera, Dean of the Rossier School of Education at USC.
And I'm Louis Freedberg, Interim CEO of EdSource and Executive Producer of this podcast. Before we start, we wanted to thank our sponsors, the Hewlett Foundation and School Services of California, without whose support this podcast would not have been possible.
So the November 5th elections are expected to have an impact on almost every aspect of government and public policy. In this week's podcast, we will take a deeper dive into what promises both President-elect Trump and the GOP have made regarding both pre-K through 12 education and post-secondary education. To that end, we're pleased to welcome two guests. First, Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. I have collaborated with Rick on a range of projects, including our own podcast called Common Ground, and even published a book with Rick called A Search for Common Ground, Conversations about the Toughest Questions in K-12 Education. And it's in that spirit we're having today's conversation. Rick, thanks for being with us.
Good to be with you.
We also want to welcome Steve Brint. He is Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Public Policy at the University of California at Riverside. Steve has focused on higher education for many years. His most recent book is Two Cheers for Higher Education. Wonder what happened to the third cheer. Maybe Steve will fill us in on that. 6 months ago, he wrote a prescient piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education on the potential impact of a Trump presidency on higher education. We've asked him to join us to revisit what he wrote about then, now that we are on the verge of another Trump presidency. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you.
So let's get started with Rick first. Rick, the issue that's gotten the most attention so far has been Trump's call for getting rid of the U.S. Department of Education. That's not a new idea, but it sounds like he's serious about making it happen. What are your thoughts about this? And is it a good thing, a bad thing? Where do you think they might run into some difficulty?
I mean, I think it'd be a just fine thing, but it's not going to happen. You need 60 votes to dismantle a department. Even if Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins were up for voting to dismantle the department, which is no sure thing, I don't know where they would get 1D, much less 7 Democratic senators to go along. So you're not going to get a statutory vote to dismantle the department, but there's still a great deal that can be done to, substantially overhaul the federal footprint via reconciliation or executive authority.
If I could just ask a follow-up question before we go on to Steve. There are a lot of red states, red communities across the country that benefit from the policies and the programs. I'm thinking about Pell Grants that go to all kinds of students, as well as Title I and other protections. Wouldn't that be part of the opposition too, that you have a lot of Republicans that benefit from the U.S. Department of Education?
Dismantling the department doesn't actually have any obvious budgetary impact. You could dismantle the department, and that would not necessarily affect $1 of IDEA or Title I or Pell. Those would be different votes. The famous illustration on this was in 2012, Michelle Bachmann was on the stage thundering about the need to abolish the Department of Education when she was, I think, momentarily leading the pack. And then she flew back to D.C. and the next day voted against any cuts to special education. So, these are actually two different conversations. What's going to happen to spending levels versus what's going to happen to the department. And you're absolutely right that when you think about special education spending, Title I spending, Pell Grants, the support for the outlays tends to be deeply bipartisan.
But I did want to ask Steve Brint about the impact, should they actually close the Department of Education? Because one of the things the department does is handle student loans. And everybody's like, oh, well, what's going to happen to these loans? Steve, any thoughts on that piece of it?
Well, I assume that if they did close the department, and I agree with Rick that seems very unlikely that that could happen, but if they did, I presume that there would be some other agency of government that would take over that function. The function's not going to go away. So it would go to labor or some other federal agency.
Treasury most likely is what folks tend to expect.
One agency or another. So the kinds of things the federal government does in terms of student loans and Pell Grants, unless there was other legislation, would continue. They just continue under a different authority.
I do have to ask you, though, I think there is one other sub-department in the Department of Education, which is the Office of Civil Rights, which has been contentious one. And there's concerns that that department would be abolished, or what would happen around civil rights and education in the current climate. Rick, I see you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, no, I think it will be very far from abolished. I think there is going to be unbelievably aggressive civil rights enforcement. But for the first time in the history of the department, we are going to see a Republican administration aggressively and unapologetically embracing the full discretion of executive authority. So if you think back, for instance, to what Catherine Lamont did with investigations and then dear colleague guidance on, say, Title IX and campus assault.
And she was the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights.
She was, the Obama Biden administration. I think there's a very high likelihood that a Trump OCR is going to go very aggressively after colleges and schools, which it has deemed to be insufficiently serious about protecting the rights of Jewish students under Title VI in terms of hostile learning environments in the wake of last October. I think you will expect it to take a very hard look at instructional materials and instruction which engage in gross stereotypes based on race or ethnicity, deeming those to be in violation of the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause. And for higher ed, that could mean institutions are no longer eligible for federal grants. It could put their federal research funding at risk, their Pell eligibility at risk. There's a lot of questions about whether colleges are actually honoring the Supreme Court's ruling in SFFA, that's the affirmative action case. I think you will see public record requests and investigations of institutions which are suspected to be trying to sidestep the Supreme Court ruling. So no, I don't think the OCR is going anywhere. I think what folks are going to be a little shocked by is for the first time, they're going to see a Republican administration using OCR the same way that the Obama or Biden administrations did.
OCR being Office of Civil Rights. Steve Brent, a lot of this would affect higher education, right?
Yes, I agree with Rick that it's likely to take a different tack than it has before. And if you look at the Supreme Court's decision on affirmative action and their interpretation of the 14th Amendment, protection of white students is going to be a priority for the Trump administration. Any programs that seem to suggest that whites are responsible for systemic racism or anything of that nature is likely to come under the scrutiny. It's a different day, so to speak, in government, and the direction of OCR is going to change dramatically.
I would imagine that if they target a college or colleges, there'll be pushback and they'll get tied up in courts. And as we all know, that could take a while to get resolved. Do you think that that would be what happens, or there would be a fast resolution?
Folks in the education space are going to be furious about this, but what they need to understand is what's likely to be happening is nothing that hasn't been done. UCLA, for instance, had a situation last spring where Jewish students were barred from the campus quad by protesters for weeks. The campus stood idly by, allowing this to occur. This seems like a cut and dried violation of Title VI. Institutions, in order, again, they promised to the federal government as a condition of being eligible for federal grants, for Pell, for research fundings, that they will uphold these protections. What'll happen is, in all likelihood, a Trump Office of Civil Rights will go in. They will start to investigate. So where they think they have evidence of clear violations, that would then give a Trump administration clear ground to reach out and say, here's what it means to uphold the Supreme Court language and what equal protection means. Here's what it means to enforce protections for all students.
Just a quick comment from you, Steve. You might have a different analysis.
Well, I would suspect that the states will try to sue if, for example, financial aid funds are stripped or research funds are cut. I don't know that they'll be successful. And I also think that it will only take one or two of these cases before you'll see widespread compliance, because This is a huge lever that the federal government has, this financial lever, both in terms of financial aid, which is twice as much as research funding. I think it's about $111 billion in financial aid and about half of that for research funding. Universities are absolutely dependent on that money. They can't survive without that money. So the lever is extremely serious. And one guesses that compliance will follow shortly after the first or second case goes forward, if one does go forward.
Can I bring up an issue around race and the way race is playing out in this? As you know, the federal government requires school districts to report student achievement data on the basis of race. We've been doing that in health and in other areas as well, which exposes disparities when you do that. But they've also, the courts have ruled, said you can't use race as a way of concocting remedies. How would you expect this will play out with respect to the Department of Ed?
Folks like Stephen Miller, who's going to be Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and was kind of point on hard-edged immigration enforcement as a wonder kid in the first Trump White House. Folks like Miller have made it very clear that this whole Biden equity DEI apparatus that they have sought to promote in the federal government, they will do their very best to dig it out and roll it back. That will have a lot of implications here. Or to use race-based differentiation in an active way. I think that's obviously going out the door. And what's useful for people to keep in mind is that most of our simple kind of racial caricature that we've grown used to in the education debate simply did not play out in this national election. The only major demographic group that Trump lost voter support with was white voters. He was about a point down from 2020. Trump ran the best with the African-American vote since any Republican in a half century. He ran the best with the Latino vote of any Republican in exit survey history. So partly the Trump administration, I think, feels like it is on politically solid ground and on the moral high ground, and I certainly agree, in trying to move away from an undue emphasis on race identity as a foundational pillar. And I think whether folks agree or not, that's what they should expect for the next 4 years.
Steve Brent.
I would be very surprised if this kind of demographic reporting goes away. I think it's not absolutely unprecedented in the world to ban reporting of racial ethnic statistics. It's illegal in Germany, for example, to do that because they have had such a vexed history with race and religion. And so I don't expect that, but it's not absolutely outside of the realm of possibility in 10 or 20 years that something like that could happen. Just seems unlikely to me at this time.
But one of the things that's been talked about for a long time on the Republican side is challenging how the way colleges and universities get accredited. What is that all about?
There are several different approaches to accreditation reform that are circulating in Washington now. Some in Congress, the Trump administration has ideas. Some of the people who advise Trump, like Chris Rufo, have ideas about this, and they don't all necessarily align. So, for example, Ron DeSantis has said, we won't accredit you if you do DEI. He wants to have his own accreditation in Florida. Something like that could catch on. In Congress, Virginia Foxx has focused more on, can students pay back their loans and are they getting jobs, and trying to put much more market-oriented rules in about accreditation. Trump has floated the idea that there needs to be attention to the so-called American tradition, which is going to be very difficult for Democrats and Republicans to agree on what that would mean. But he has made that a feature of his accreditation reform proposals.
Yeah, no, I think accreditation is absolutely going to be a major source of contention. The right's argument is that higher ed accreditation, especially for four-year institutions, operates like a cartel, is just a huge headache. So there's huge concerns about creating barriers to entry. When you look at the major accreditors, Among their major pillars, they often explicitly embrace DEI. So on the right, you find frustrations that institutions, even if they weren't so inclined, feel pressured by the accreditation process to create bureaucracies and embrace the tenets of DEI. What the accreditors as they stand don't focus on, like Steve said, are things like outcomes. So there's an argument that what you want is a much more robust and dynamic accreditation sector with accreditors who have particular missions and which create opportunities for new entry. Steve referred to the kind of the relevant parts of the Higher Ed Act. This is actually going to be one of those places where those state attorney generals, Pedro, are going to get in the game. What the Trump folks in all likelihood are going to try to do is take executive authority and say it's well within their bounds to throw out the existing accreditation framework and create a new framework, which is going to push out some of the old guys, create opportunities for new entrants. It's very possible the Democratic state attorney generals will try to sue. And what will be a question was, one, if they can get standing. This was a continuing source of drama, if you recall, from the student loan lawsuits. And if they have standing, then it will be a question of whether or not that kind of executive discretion exists under the current language of the HEA, or as Steve mentions, whether you would actually need to reauthorize the law. There are deals to be struck on Capitol Hill on higher ed accountability, on higher ed kind of federal policy. You could potentially imagine a bipartisan deal getting done on which accreditation was one piece of it. But if they can't do it through executive authority, it becomes much less likely that it's actually going to happen.
We've talked about race, and let's talk about gender and transgendered students and how this might play out in the new administration. Title IX is one of those provisions that comes under the U.S. Department of Ed, and women's sports are very popular, but it's had a big impact on campuses in terms of athletics and equity in access for women and men. And now recently the transgender participation. What do you expect might come up here on those two fronts?
You know, it's obviously a hot button political issue, and the Republicans clearly made a lot of gains from highlighting that issue because it's something that the public at large feels very differently about than many academics do. There's a desire to be as inclusive as possible in academia, but the public doesn't seem to want to encourage transgender surgeries or anything like that. And so you have the potential here for a conflict between liberal academia and the more conservative public.
Rick, you were nodding your head, or?
Obviously, the Trump department is going to issue a statement that allowing biological males into women's sports in high school or college is a gross violation of Title IX, that it creates a hostile environment, that this is going to be true of dormitories, single-sex dormitories and rooms. It'll be true of showers and locker rooms. It'll be true of sports. Presumably, this will be adjudicated. We'll see how the courts sort it out. It'll partly be a question of how do you interpret the existing language of sex and what does that mean when you are trying to stretch this to include gender? Folks should be aware that this is, precisely what the Biden folks did and the Obama folks before them. They try to take existing statutory language and they read it in the way that they thought was right. Elections have consequences. It's now going to go the other direction. And one of the things is that the polling on this suggests, as Steve mentioned, this is not a close issue. Well, in academia, there is a lot of support for kind of the impositions implied by a gender-based culture. Everybody uses pronouns, and 19,000 plus public schools have formal policies where if the child requests, they will hide the child's at-school gender identity from parents. The larger public thinks parents ought to know how the child is identified at school. Larger public does not think it's a good idea to have biological males playing in women's sports in high school or college. So we'll see how it shakes out.
I mean, one of the things that strikes me about this conversation, talking about the extensive impact that a second Trump administration could have. I mean, Trump was in power for 4 years before, and he was in charge of the Department of Education. And at that time, I think the reality was it didn't have much impact. Why is this term going to be so different?
Because I think conservatives have learned from what they feel like the Trump administration got wrong in 2016. One. And two, that you've seen a fundamental shift in the center of gravity in the Republican Party. For all of the unbelievable, unfair attacks and grief that Betsy DeVos got, people completely lost sight of the fact that she was very much a traditional Reagan-Romney conservative. Betsy believed in dotting I's and crossing T's. She was very aware of not expanding the federal footprint. She was hugely deferential to Congress. And for all of that, what Republicans saw was her get vilified, and they saw the Biden department come in and day one show none of that same kind of humility or measurement. So what's happened, especially in the Republican Party in 2016, to which Trump was an outsider, in 2024 that has been very much Trumpified, what you are going to see is the national conservatives go in with a mindset that we're going to use the department the same way, I could be wrong, but I suspect I'm right, going to use the department the same way Obama and Biden's folks did, which is a profound shift from 2016. And then the other thing is that between the school closure fights, the masking, the CRT, DEI, transgender fights, what has grown up in the last 5 years is a network of organizations and advocacy groups on the right that have developed a pipeline of staff and a series of playbooks that were literally nowhere in evidence when the Trump transition was getting plotted out in 2016. So when you talk to the Trump transition today versus when Gerard and Bill Evers were running the Trump education transition in 2016, it is like going from horse and buggy to the post-industrial age. It is just a fundamentally different world. And I think a lot of folks in higher ed are going to be quite surprised by that shift.
I have a slightly different interpretation. I think that Republicans have been very good at identifying weak spots in terms of where the public will disagree with things that are happening in the academy. And they're very good at elevating anecdotes for dramatic effect. They won't credit all of the good things that are going on in colleges and universities and in K-12 classrooms for that matter. Our leaders in academia have been not very good at making the counter case. Politicians are just really well skilled at elevating anecdotes and then using those dramatic anecdotes to have a much broader policy portfolio come into play. And as Rick said, there is this whole organizational ecology in the second Trump administration to follow through and to develop game plans and the contacts with the relevant parties to make these policy changes happen. So I see it as a kind of a political machine that is able to find the weak spots or the perceived weak spots and then capitalize on them. And I'm not dismissing the fact that there are weak spots. I mean, there are, but it's very unbalanced from my point of view.
You're suggesting that the Republicans are more of a political machine and more focused on anecdote than the Democrats were in the Obama or Biden years on education?
I haven't done as much of a study of the Democrats. I'm prepared to believe that Democrats operate the same way.
Okay, that's all I would say.
So let me just point out something that might get in the way of this well-oiled machine that you're predicting is going to show up, Rick. And that's the unknown. We could have a mass shooting on a college campus. We could have some other incident that will, like a war, that will take precedent over this agenda and suddenly become the priority to address, including DACA. The fact that there are many undocumented students now who are at American universities and colleges. And if DACA is eliminated, which I imagine they're going to go after, then how will that play out on college campuses?
Yeah, I mean, the immigration stuff and immigration enforcement is going to be a huge issue. And, one of the things we've seen about American politics the last 8 years is the best thing for the left was the first Trump presidency, and the best thing for the right was the Biden presidency. So it's very easy to see, Trump sending ICE to campus and triggering enormous pushback and sympathy for the folks in higher ed. Well, one thing I would say, Pedro, though, is if we were talking about legislation, so trying to figure out how do you get those votes to abolish the department or how to pass a voucher bill, I would totally agree about the impact of those unexpected events. Most of what we're talking about is going to happen underneath the radar of the regular world. It'll be big in education, and it's going to happen whatever else is going on in the world, because it's not like international affairs or economic dislocation. Another big thing that's likely to happen, for instance, is President Trump and the Republican Congress are likely to pass the biggest federal voucher bill in history, but nobody will notice it, because what they'll do is they're just going to do it as an amendment to next year's big tax bill. Remember, the 2017 tax bill's up for reauthorization. You can do a $5 billion tax credit for tax scholarships, tack it on. In the scheme of things, it's a tiny bill, so it won't get a lot of attention in the regular world. But in our space, it will be by far and away the biggest federal school choice program ever enacted. One of the things, if I can just make a plea to your listeners, you got to make sure over the next 4 years, you're making sure you talk at least occasionally to Republican, try to make an effort to actually see what conservatives are saying, not what, a UC Berkeley professor tells you conservatives are saying. Pedro and I think, have benefited enormously from our conversations over the last 5 years. And I just think it's a healthy discipline for everybody.
But we need to get some more reasonable conservatives out there, Rick, so we can have a conversation.
I would say if our campuses were filled with more reasonable progressives, then we'd be well on the way.
We've been talking to Steve Brent, professor of sociology and public policy at UC Riverside, and Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy at American Enterprise Institute. I want to thank you both for your time and for raising these important issues that can affect the country. So thank you both.
Thank you for an interesting conversation.
Yeah, good to be with all of you.
And I should note that we recorded this episode just a day before Donald Trump nominated Linda McMahon to be his next Secretary of Education. She's the former CEO of the World Wrestling Enterprise and co-chair of his transition team. We also appreciate the support from the Hewlett Foundation and School Services of California, sponsors of this week's episode. Thanks also to our producer, Kobe McDonald, and sound recordist, Emil Klein. Please be sure to sign up wherever you listen to your podcast for the next episode of Sparking Equity.
I'm Pedro Noguera.
And I'm Louis Freedberg.
Thanks for listening.